Something happens in certain relationships that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. You begin to lose confidence in your own memory. Not in a vague, forgetful way, but specifically, surgically. You remember saying something. You remember clearly. And then someone tells you, with complete calm, that you never said it. They don't hesitate. They don't look away. They seem, if anything, mildly concerned for you. And somewhere in the gap between your memory and their certainty, something starts to crack. The disturbing thing isn't that this happens. The disturbing thing is how effective it is. We like to think of our minds as private, sealed chambers. That what we saw, we saw. What we felt, we felt. But the truth is that memory is reconstructive. Identity is fragile. And the experience of reality is far more dependent on consensus than we'd like to admit. Give someone enough time, enough authority, and enough repetition, and they can reach inside another person's mind and rearrange the furniture. And the person won't necessarily know it's happening. This is what gaslighting is. Not just lying, not just manipulation in the generic sense. It's something more targeted, a systematic assault on someone's ability to trust their own perception. The word gets used casually now, flattened into a shorthand for any disagreement or deception. But the clinical phenomenon is precise, specific, and genuinely disturbing. Not because it requires a monster, but because it requires a relationship. The term comes from a 1938 British play by Patrick Hamilton, later adapted into a film in 1944, directed by George Cukor Dida. In it, a husband slowly dims the gas lights in his home, and then tells his wife she's imagining it. He hides things and accuses her of misplacing them. He isolates her from friends, dismisses her perceptions, and ultimately convinces her, and begins to convince himself, that she is losing her mind. It was a thriller, but it was also a blueprint. What Hamilton intuited, and what decades of psychology have since confirmed, is that the self is not self-contained. Who we believe we are, what we believe we've done, what we think is real. All of this is built and maintained in relationship with others. George Herbert Mead called this the looking glass self. We understand ourselves partly by seeing ourselves reflected back through other people's eyes. Gaslighting exploits this. It doesn't need to erase your memory. It only needs to make you distrust it. There's a concept in trauma psychology called betrayal blindness, developed by Jennifer Freyd at the University of Oregon. Her theory is that when abuse comes from someone you depend on, a parent, a partner, an employer, the psyche often fails to fully register what's happening. Not from stupidity, from necessity. The mind protects the relationship because the relationship is necessary for survival. This means gaslighting is most effective precisely where it's most dangerous, in close, high-dependency bonds. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance explains part of the mechanism. When two pieces of information conflict, I trust this person and this person is lying to me. The mind works to resolve the tension, and often it resolves it in the direction of the relationship, rather than the direction of reality. Because relationships are felt, reality is abstract. The gaslit person doesn't just accept the manipulation passively, they actively participate in constructing the alternative version, because the alternative version is less painful. In 1951, Solomon Asch ran a series of experiments that should still unsettle us. He sat subjects in a room with several Confederates and asked them to identify which of three lines matched a reference line. The answer was obvious. But when all the Confederates gave the wrong answer first, roughly a third of the subjects gave the wrong answer too. Not because they couldn't see, but because they doubted what they saw. They trusted the group's reality over their own perception. Asch was testing conformity, but he was also showing us the substrate that gaslighting operates on. The social nature of certainty. What distinguishes gaslighting from ordinary conflict is escalation over time. It rarely begins with a dramatic confrontation. It begins with small corrections. That's not what I said. You always exaggerate. You're being too sensitive. Each instance, in isolation, seems negligible. The target often agrees. Yes, Perhaps they did misremember. Yes, perhaps they are being oversensitive. But the cumulative effect is the slow erosion of epistemic self-confidence. By the time the more overt distortions begin, the target no longer trusts their own reactions enough to identify them as wrong. Freyd also identified a specific pattern called DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. When confronted, the gaslighter denies, then attacks the credibility of the person confronting them, and then repositions themselves as the real victim. The target ends up apologizing for bringing it up. They end up comforting the person who hurt them. This inversion is one of the most disorienting features of gaslighting. The way it makes the accuser feel like the aggressor. The target walks away not just disbelieved, but guilty. Over time, gaslighting doesn't just distort individual memories or perceptions. It begins to distort the self. Robin Stern, a psychologist who has written extensively on the subject, describes the gaslight effect as something that hollows out confidence in ways that spread beyond the relationship. The target begins to doubt their professional competence, their emotional responses, their judgment in other contexts. The distorted reality becomes the interior architecture of the person. This is what makes recovery so difficult. The damage isn't stored in memory as a discrete trauma. It's embedded in the structure of how someone relates to themselves. Gaslighting is not only interpersonal. Institutions gaslight. Governments gaslight. Don't. The Soviet practice of punitive psychiatry, institutionalizing political dissidents under diagnoses like sluggish schizophrenia, was gaslighting weaponized at a state level. You believe the state is oppressive. The state tells you that belief is a symptom of mental illness. Your dissent becomes your diagnosis. The perversity is not incidental. It is the mechanism. In medicine, the phenomenon has its own literature. Medical gaslighting, in which patients, disproportionately women and people of color, are told their symptoms are psychosomatic, exaggerated, or anxiety-driven, is documented across conditions including endometriosis, lupus, and chronic pain disorders. Studies have found that women wait significantly longer than men for pain medication in emergency settings. The message the patient receives repeatedly is that their body is not telling them the truth. Their symptoms are performance, not signal. The institution that should be the most rigorous arbiter of reality becomes instead a source of epistemic injury. In organizational settings, gaslighting takes the form of structural denial. An employee raises concerns about a hostile work environment. They're told they misread the situation. Their performance review suddenly notes that they struggle to work well with others. The documented harassment becomes a record of the employee's own difficulty. Evan Stark's work on coercive control, developed in the context of domestic abuse, but applicable more broadly, identifies the systematic use of reality denial as a method of controlling behavior without explicit demands. You don't need to command someone who no longer trusts their own judgment. In intimate relationships, gaslighting often coexists with isolation from support networks, financial dependency, and intermittent reinforcement, in which warmth and cruelty alternate in patterns that produce profound attachment. The intermittent nature matters. If a relationship were only harmful, leaving would be less complicated. But gaslighting typically operates within a relationship that also contains genuine intimacy, humor, love. The target is not responding to a monster. They are responding to a person they know. Someone who has been kind to them, who now seems to be telling them something about themselves that they cannot fully refute. There's a pattern sometimes called the Cassandra phenomenon. After the Greek prophet cursed to know the truth and not be believed, people who have been gaslit extensively often find that when they finally do speak about their experience, they are not believed. They've been so thoroughly trained to express uncertainty about their own perceptions that they sound uncertain. Their hesitation reads as unreliability. The very damage makes the testimony sound like doubt. The gaslit person becomes, in a cruel irony, their own worst witness. In a cultural moment saturated with competing narratives and epistemically fractured media environments, gaslighting has scaled. when entire information ecosystems can be weaponized to make people doubt documented events, elections, atrocities, scientific consensus, we are looking at gaslighting as infrastructure. The individual mechanism becomes a collective one. The psychological features are the same. Repetition, confident delivery, the social normalization of alternative accounts, the delegitimization of anyone who insists on the original record. Recognizing gaslighting from inside it is genuinely difficult, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. There are, however, patterns that researchers and clinicians point to. A persistent, nameless sense that something is wrong that you cannot articulate. The habit of compulsively seeking external validation for your own perceptions. The feeling of chronic self-doubt that appears only in relation to a specific person. The experience of leaving conversations feeling confused rather than resolved, even after the other person seemed entirely reasonable. These are not diagnostic criteria. They're signals worth attending to. One reason gaslighting is so resistant to naming is that it requires believing that someone you care about is deliberately undermining your reality, and that belief feels like an enormous accusation to make. The mind resists it partly for ethical reasons. To accuse someone of this feels serious, feels potentially unjust, feels like something that requires certainty before you're permitted to say it. The gaslighter benefits from your scrupulousness. Your reluctance to make serious claims without sufficient evidence becomes the mechanism by which evidence never accumulates. What Stark, Stern, and others who work in coercive control do emphasize is the value of documentation. Not as evidence for a court, but as an anchor for your own perception. The simple act of writing something down when it happens, before the conversation that will reframe it, creates a record that exists outside the relationship. It is a way of trusting your own experience before someone else has the opportunity to revise it. Not evidence of paranoia. Evidence of the desire to remain accurate. The reason gaslighting disturbs in a way that other forms of abuse do not quite is that it targets the instrument by which we would ordinarily detect and respond to harm. Most injuries leave the mind intact to register them. A broken bone hurts, and your perception of that hurt is reliable. Gaslighting doesn't just cause harm. It corrupts the capacity to recognize harm. It attacks epistemology. It makes you a worse reader of your own experience. And once trust in your own perception is sufficiently damaged, almost anything can be made to seem like your problem. What gaslighting reveals finally is something uncomfortable about the nature of selfhood. The self we experience as private, stable, and self-validating is in fact a social construction maintained in constant negotiation with others. This is not a flaw. It is how humans are built. The same openness that makes us capable of genuine intimacy, of being changed by love or grief or new ideas, is the openness that makes us vulnerable to this. We are permeable to other people's versions of reality. We need to be. There is no tidy resolution to that. No reframing that makes it fully safe. What you can perhaps hold on to is this: the very fact that you are asking the question, that something is wrong, that you don't quite trust what you've been told about yourself, is itself a form of perception. Gaslighting works through doubt. But doubt, turned in the right direction, can also be the first thing that pulls you back. The question, am I losing my mind, can be the beginning of losing it, or it can be the beginning of finding out that your mind, this whole time, was working exactly as it should.